I've loved Yu-Gi-Oh since I was a kid, and while I didn't discover Magic the Gathering until later, I now consider myself a fan of both. I couldn't help but wonder what would it be like to see Yu-Gi-Oh cards translated into Magic cards. Well, here are 15 Yu-Gi-Oh cards from a parallel universe where they have mana values. We're starting out with Blue Eyes White Dragon, because of course we are, right? It's arguably the most iconic monster in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! And has been a fan favorite for literal decades at this point. However, keeping the original card in mind, it's a fairly unimpressive vanilla by today's standards, albeit with some good stats. In Magic, I think Blue Eyes would cost 5 generic, 1 white, and 1 blue mana. It would be an 8/7 dragon with flying and trample. Flying because it's always airborne in the anime, and trample because I felt like it deserved a little extra oomph, you know? Now, if we're talking iconic monsters, we can't leave out Dark Magician. In a similar vein as Blue Eyes, I couldn't buff him too much, so I made him a human wizard that can be summoned for 5 generic and 1 black. He's a 7/6 with hexproof because mastery over magical spells seems right up his alley flavor-wise. Moving on to a slightly less famous card, I picked Cestus of Dagla next to see if one of Yu-Gi-Oh's more niche effects would translate into Magic. Turns out it was super easy, barely an inconvenience. Cestus of Dagla would be an equipment artifact, let's say costing 2 generic mana with an equip cost of 2 for any creature and 1 for a fairy. I nixed the Yu-Gi-Oh stipulation that it could only be used on fairy creatures, but I wanted to keep a little of that fairy favoritism in the flavor by making its equip cost twice as cheap. A creature wielding Cestus of Dagla would gain +2/+0 and lifelink, an homage to the real spell card's life point gaining effect. Tell me, would this card be any good in the actual game? We already covered Dark Magician, but who could forget his equally famous pupil, Dark Magician Girl? Like in Yu-Gi-Oh, I think she would be slightly cheaper to summon than her teacher, 4 generic and 1 black mana, and she'd be a 5/4 human wizard, also with hexproof. However, she would get a bonus ability similar to her real-life card. Dark Magician Girl gets +1/+1 for each wizard in your graveyard. I feel like name-specific graveyard requirements are much more common in Yu-Gi-Oh than in Magic, so I opted to give DMG a more MTG-oriented ability. Legendary Fiend is, well, just that, a fiend whose effect revolves around it gaining attack points each turn. There are tons of Magic cards that do similar things, so bringing this guy over was easy too. Legendary Fiend would have to be a legendary demon creature just based on its name. It'd cost 2 generic and 2 black to summon, and it'd be a 3/5 with flying. At the beginning of your upkeep, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Legendary Fiend. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, the infamous Pot of Greed was a bit harder to adapt, and it's not just because the effect in Yu-Gi-Oh is so complicated that I had to spend a couple hours poring over historical rulings just to figure out what it actually does. It's because Magic has similar draw spells, but the name Pot of Greed doesn't translate so cleanly to an MTG sorcery. Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't have any artifact or item cards, the closest thing would be equip spell cards, so spells and traps can signify actions or events, but they often also signify objects. I wanted to make sure Pot of Greed wasn't just your basic sorcery in Magic, and instead the artifact it deserves to be. Pot of Greed would cost 1 generic and 1 blue to cast because blue is all about draw power, and it would have an activated ability costing 2 generic to tap and sacrifice it in order to draw 2 cards. Hopefully this is a much more balanced version of a card that will likely never be unbanned in Yu-Gi-Oh! In both Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic, your opponent gaining control of one of your creatures is almost always a bad thing, unless you're playing hot potato with a monster like Lava Golem. Since this volcanic menace does damage to its controller, it's not necessarily one you want to have on your side of the field. Its effect was also fairly easy to adapt to Magic's format. It would have to be a tough creature like its Yu-Gi-Oh! Counterpart, an 8/7 elemental for 3 generic and 2 red mana. When Lava Golem enters the battlefield, target opponent gains control of it. At the beginning of your upkeep, Lava Golem deals 5 damage to you. I think I evened out the point values to be roughly equivalent. What do you think? For a slightly trickier card, let's move on to Swords of Revealing Light. This would be a semi-permanent enchantment for 3 white mana. Swords of Revealing Light enters the battlefield with 3 sword counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove 1 sword counter from Swords of Revealing Light. When Swords of Revealing Light has no sword counters on it, sacrifice it. While Swords of Revealing Light has 1 or more sword counters, creatures cannot attack you. The systematic removal of sword counters functions as a way to make the enchantment semi-permanent, a way to keep track of how many turns have passed in a way that matches the card's flavoring and how it was depicted in the anime. However, it also introduces a way for both you and your opponent to interact with it outside of destruction or exile, the adding or removal of counters. Could this be part of a punishing proliferate combo to prevent your opponents from ever attacking you, or would this never see any play? I truly don't know enough about the meta to tell. But even a filthy casual like me knows that board wipes are nothing new to Magic, so Dark Hole was a cinch to translate. This would be a sorcery for 2 generic and 2 black mana, destroy all creatures. In fact, it's basically a color-swapped version of an already existing board wipe, Day of Judgment, which just so happens to be white instead of black. A card that was a bit harder to adapt faithfully was Raigeki. Symmetrical board wipes are fairly simple and straightforward. You stand to lose just as much as your opponent. But what about asymmetrical board wipes? These are rare, coveted effects in both games, but whereas the Yu-Gi-Oh card's power can be limited by the ban list or once per turn clauses, Magic needs to give it an appropriate mana cost. The closest analog I found was Dread Cacodemon, an 8/8 for 7 generic and 3 black mana. Its ETB destroys all enemy creatures, but it also taps all creatures you control. Something important to consider is the fact that this Raigeki-like effect also gives you an extra 8/8 body, which is pretty substantial. Imagine if Raigeki destroyed all your opponent's monsters and created a Blue Eyes White Dragon token on top of that in exchange for not attacking that turn. To keep it in the spirit of the original card, I decided to keep the big cost minus the body of Dread Cacodemon, making Raigeki a sorcery costing 4 generic, 4 white, and 2 red mana, destroy all creatures your opponents control. That was complicated. Let's get back to the basics with Kuriboh. Everybody's favorite fiendish fluffball from the OG anime is a wimp when it comes to battle stats, but excels at preventing damage. In Magic, Kuriboh would be a 1/1 demon costing 1 blue and 1 black mana to summon. To give him that hand trap-like effect, he would also have flash and flying. When Kuriboh enters the battlefield, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to you this turn. I have a confession to make. Kuriboh is basically Selfless Squire, just with flying and without the ability to gain +1/+1 counters. That just goes to show that there's already space for a monster like Kuriboh in the game. Now, does he make any sense mechanically or according to Magic's mana color philosophies? That's a different story. Selfless Squire is a creature I played recently in a game of Commander, as it was included in a pre-con I bought, Blame Game. That deck also gave me an idea for another card adaptation, Magic Cylinder. This is an instant that costs 1 blue and 1 red mana. The next time a creature would deal combat damage to you this turn, prevent that damage. If damage is prevented this way, Magic Cylinder deals that much damage to that creature's controller. Magic Cylinder is basically a color-tweaked iteration of Deflecting Palm, its effect modified to focus specifically on combat damage. Instead of 1 white and 1 red, I made it cost 1 blue and 1 red, blue for the magical aspect of its flavor, and red obviously for the damage. The Egyptian god cards are among my most favorite cards in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! And I know I'm not alone in that, so I wanted to make sure I ported them over faithfully while also giving them some exciting abilities befitting their divine status. Slifer the Sky Dragon is a legendary dragon god costing 4 generic and 3 red mana to summon. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice 3 creatures. If Slifer wasn't cast, at the beginning of the next end step, sacrifice it. Split second, shroud, flying, trample. This creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your hand. Whenever an opponent casts a creature spell, Slifer the Sky Dragon deals 5 damage to that creature. MTG Slifer retains the cost to sacrifice 3 creatures, as well as its so-called second mouth ability as it's called in the anime. Slifer snipes any creature that an opponent summons, squashing the little ones on entry. Interestingly, Magic is almost better suited to this ability of Slifer's, as the structure of Yu-Gi-Oh's battle mechanics don't really allow for damage to individual monsters. Side note, Slifer was always my favorite Egyptian god and still is to this day. The Winged Dragon of Ra would be similar in a lot of ways to Slifer. It would be a legendary dragon god for 4 generic and 3 white mana, and it would be a 0/1. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice 3 creatures. The Winged Dragon of Ra gains power and toughness equal to the combined power and toughness of those creatures. If Ra wasn't cast, at the beginning of the next end step, sacrifice it. Split second, shroud, flying, trample. When the Winged Dragon of Ra enters the battlefield, you can pay life until you have 1 life remaining. It gains that much power and toughness. Pay 3 life, destroy target creature. Ra was basically about tweaking the point values to make them MTG appropriate and copying some of the other aspects of Slifer. I had to get a bit more creative with Obelisk the Tormentor, but I really like how it turned out. Obelisk would be a legendary demon god for 4 generic and 3 black mana. Of course, it would be a 10/10, half the standard life total, just like Yu-Gi-Oh! Obelisk has half the standard life point total for its stats. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice 3 creatures. If Obelisk wasn't cast, at the beginning of the next end step, sacrifice it. Split second, shroud, trample. Tap, sacrifice 2 non-token creatures, destroy all creatures target opponent controls. Having it tap nixes the convoluted text about it not being able to attack the turn you use this ability, and I wanted to make sure that token decks couldn't abuse this ability either. While it's not typically depicted as flying, at least not in most duels, it still needed Split Second, Shroud, and Trample to give it that godly untouchability and impact. The power to wipe an opponent's entire board of creatures on a 10/10 body should do just fine on the ground anyway. Is Obelisk overcosted? Would this break the meta of Magic, or would it find an appropriate niche? Let me know how I did with this card and all these other cards in the comments below, and please subscribe for more Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh content. Thanks for watching!